Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to discuss the solubility of organic molecules. So we've seen before that cells are constructed of both organic and inorganic molecules. In a previous video we defined an organic molecule as being any molecule that contains both carbon and hydrogen. An organic molecule can contain any number of different types of elements, but it at minimum has to contain both carbon and hydrogen. As far as inorganic molecules go, a previous video of ours defined water as being the most important inorganic molecule in the body. So as far as the important organic molecules go, most of these are going to be what we call macromolecules. Of the macromolecules, we have the carbohydrates, which contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, lipids, which also contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, proteins, which contain not only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but also nitrogen and sulfur, and then finally the nucleic acids, which contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus atoms. You can see that these different types of macromolecules all contain at least carbon and hydrogen, which again is what makes them organic. And we will have videos that are separately dedicated to each of these four macromolecules in the future. So the wide variety of different types of organic molecules that we can make and that can have different types of unique functions in the human body, we can owe to the very unique chemistry of carbon atoms in particular. Now, if we look at the atomic structure of a carbon atom, carbon has an atomic number of 6, which means that it has 6 protons in its nucleus. For a neutral carbon atom, this is going to mean that carbon will also have 6 electrons orbiting the nucleus in the electron cloud. So the most common isotope of carbon has 6 neutrons as well, and this is going to give this particular kind of carbon atom a mass number of 12. As I said before, the most important thing to consider is the number of electrons that circle the nucleus in the electron cloud. So for a single carbon atom that is electrically neutral, this number will be 6. So the first energy level contains 2 electrons, and then the remaining 4 electrons organize themselves into the second energy level. This is important because we can immediately identify that this carbon atom has 4 valence electrons. Recall that a valence electron is an electron that is in the outermost energy level for any given atom. And it is especially important because it is the number of valence electrons that an atom has that is going to determine what type of chemical reaction and what type of chemical bond it likes to participate in. Now, the very fact that carbon has 4 valence electrons immediately tells us that it's very, very unlikely that carbon is ever going to participate in ionic bonding because, as you'll recall, an ionic bond is one that involves the complete transfer of electrons in order to fill up the outer shell. For carbon, this would involve either donating 4 electrons or receiving 4 electrons, neither of which is very likely. So to us, this tells us that the most likely possibility is that carbon atoms are going to form covalent bonds, which is based on the sharing of electrons rather than the complete transfer of electrons from one atom to another. So since carbon has 4 valence electrons, the most likely possibility is that carbon is going to want to form a total of 4 covalent bonds, which would involve the sharing of a total of 4 pairs of electrons. So with this in mind, knowing that every carbon atom is going to want to form a total of 4 covalent bonds, we can then move on to the next piece of information, which is that carbon can actually form bonds with a bunch of different types of atoms, and this includes other carbon atoms. So here you can actually see a long stretch of carbon atoms that are all bound together. This carbon atom forms a covalent bond with this carbon atom so that we form a very long chain, which is sometimes called a carbon skeleton. And it's upon this skeleton that we can use to build macromolecules. The question becomes, though, how do we fill in all the other covalent bonds that these carbon atoms are going to want to participate in? So in terms of, well, what are we going to fill in those blank spots with? For now, we can think of those as vacancies. We know that each carbon atom wants to form a total of 4 bonds, and for most of these carbon atoms, they're only currently forming 2 bonds, with the exceptions being these ones on the end, which are only forming 1 right now. So this is where we can get a little bit creative in terms of how do we fill in these vacancies? How do we satisfy the bonding requirements of all the carbon atoms in this skeleton? Well, one of the simplest ways of doing this is just filling in all the vacancies with hydrogen atoms. And you can check each of the carbon atoms here to make sure that each one is participating in a total of 4 covalent bonds. So this molecule that we have created here is called a hydrocarbon. It is the simplest kind of organic molecule, one that is only made of carbon and hydrogen. The problem, though, is that this is a human physiology class, and this kind of hydrocarbon molecule is totally insoluble in water. We know water is the lifeblood of human physiology and really all of biology, so if we're talking about a molecule that literally cannot dissolve in water, there's not really much point in talking about it any further. So, to make an important point here, we do want to understand why something like this hydrocarbon is not going to be soluble in water. If you look here, every single chemical bond that's being formed here is of the non-polar variety, meaning that the electrons are being shared equally between every carbon atom and every hydrogen atom, so that means there's not going to be any partial electrical charges like we saw in a water molecule or other types of polar molecules. So since there are no partial electrical charges, water cannot interact with this molecule because there's really nothing for water to grab onto. So the term we use is that this molecule here is hydrophobic. It is water-fearing. Water will not interact well with this molecule. But then that leads to an interesting question. What if instead of covering this hydrocarbon with hydrogen atoms, what if we replace one of those hydrogens with a polar OH group? Okay, well, this is very interesting. If you look here, the vast majority of this molecule is still going to be very hydrophobic. So everything that's kind of in this gray color here is still hydrophobic because most of this molecule is still very nonpolar. But what we've done here is we have introduced something that water can latch onto, something that water can grab onto. So this whole molecule is still not going to be very soluble, but we have started to lay the groundwork for, okay, well, maybe we can imagine how this molecule could, over time, if we start modifying it, how it could eventually become soluble in water. So now what you're looking at is we have replaced multiple hydrogen atoms with those polar OH groups. So now water can actually surround this molecule and grab on and interact with this molecule in a number of different places. So what we're doing here is, over time, by replacing more and more of those hydrogens with polar groups, we are improving this organic molecule's solubility in water, meaning that it becomes much more likely that it's going to be able to dissolve in aqueous environments like the blood, be transported around, and maybe it becomes more likely that it's going to have some sort of important function in human physiology. So that OH group that we just showed is an example of what is called a functional group. A functional group is just a group of atoms that can be potentially attached to a carbon backbone, and a functional group will actually impart to that carbon backbone certain chemical properties that will change the way that a molecule functions, and in some cases, how that molecule dissolves in water. So the hydroxyl group, what we just introduced, is a functional group that imparts polarity to an organic molecule and gives that molecule the ability to participate in hydrogen bonds, not only with water, but other polar molecules. So here is a table that shows you some of the important functional groups in human physiology. Certainly this is not an exhaustive list, but here you can see the hydroxyl functional group that we just introduced. This allows the molecule to be more polar, allows it to form hydrogen bonds, and you tend to find these in carbohydrates and alcohols. You have the carboxylic acid functional group, which you can see right here, the COOH. This actually causes this functional group to have a negative electrical charge at a neutral pH value, and we'll talk more about that in a future video. You tend to find these in proteins and fatty acids. The amine functional group, this NH2, is going to be positively charged at neutral pH values, and you tend to find these in proteins as well. Phosphates are very highly negatively charged, and you tend to find these in nucleic acids and phospholipids, and sometimes some proteins. The methyl functional group, on the other hand, this CH3 right here, because this is built using nothing but carbon and hydrogen, this is very nonpolar, and this is going to contribute to a molecule's hydrophobicity. You tend to find a lot of these in fatty acid molecules. And then finally, the sulfhydryl functional group, this SH, is something that we'll talk about in greater detail in a future video when we talk about proteins, but this allows for the formation of a unique type of covalent bond called a disulfide bond. So you don't necessarily have to memorize all of these functional groups, but you do need to be aware of how the presence or absence of certain functional groups will affect a molecule's solubility in water. And remember, solubility is a function of how much stuff is there for water to grab onto. Water can grab onto polar functional groups and electrically charged functional groups. It cannot grab onto non-polar functional groups. So here you can actually see that same carbon skeleton that we were looking at before and how we have attached a number of different functional groups from the table that we just saw. You can see how the amine functional group has a positive electrical charge, the carboxylic acid functional group has a negative electrical charge, the hydroxyl group has a partial negative electrical charge, again, that water can grab onto, and then the phosphate group has a strong negative electrical charge, all of which is something that water can grab onto, and this molecule here is going to be a lot more soluble in water than it otherwise would be without these functional groups. So having a solid understanding of functional group chemistry is going to allow you to accurately predict the solubility of organic molecules in water just by looking at them. And believe me, that's actually going to be a very useful skill for you as you progress throughout your human physiology course. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. Here is a list of vocabulary terms I think you ought to be aware of after this video. And then for checking your understanding, number one, why does increasing the number of partial and full electrical charges on an organic molecule increase its solubility in water? Number two, for which functional groups does their electrical charge depend on the pH? And number three, which kinds of functional groups are found in the 4 different macromolecules? All right, that's going to do it for this video. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments section, and I will see you next time. So long.